High hopes in Colombia as a 6-month ceasefire with rebels begins. The ELN is the last remaining armed group operating there. But will this deal hold after others have failed? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sohail. Rahman. Welcome to Inside Story. It's described as a monumental political achievement. For years, a ceasefire deal between the government and Colombia and the last remaining rebel group there has failed to stick. That's now changed following long-running negotiations. The government agreement is with the National Liberation Army, known as the ELN. President Gustavo Petro says it's part of his promise towards what he calls total peace. But critics are sceptical and mutual mistrust remains. So will a cessation of hostilities this time eventually lead to a peace deal? And what does it mean for communities in areas controlled by the rebels? We'll discuss all of those issues with our guests in a moment. But first, this report now from Katia Lopez-Hodayan.
President Gustavo Petro began his term with a promise to end ongoing battles with armed groups in Colombia. It appears he's delivering on that promise with the signing of a ceasefire deal with the ELN rebel group, also known as the National Liberation Army.
Hacer realidad la paz.
Peace needs to be a reality. We need to end the era of war between the insurgencies and the state. Stop the development of an incoming third form violence already present, arising from illegal economies and armed groups multiplying everywhere.
If the 6-month ceasefire holds, it will be the first major victory for Petro's peace plans. But his critics are skeptical.
I'm sad for my country. That is not the way to move Colombia forward. We fought all our lives. We have ancestors who've shed blood for freedom, and not for these armed groups to receive blessings from leftists.
For decades, the ELN has been linked to criminal activity. The government says the group finances itself through cocaine trafficking, illegal mining, and ransoms from kidnappings. Communities in ELN-controlled areas say they need and deserve assurances.
We call on the government to dismantle these paramilitary groups in Colombia by implementing whatever steps are necessary.
Petro is Colombia's first left-wing president. Before turning to politics, he joined the M19 armed group to combat suspected fraud in presidential elections. And that, some say, gave him more credibility in the latest round of negotiations with the ELN.
We know that all of Colombia has great expectations, and we come with great willingness to comply with the agreed agenda.
Colombia has long battled with armed groups, particularly the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. The peace deal in 2016 ended more than 50 years of civil war, which killed close to 250,000 people. But scars remain, particularly with continued violence in rural areas and reports of other armed groups moving into territory FARC fighters left behind. President Petro says the ceasefire is a significant step for Colombia. Affected communities agree, but say the real test is whether it will lead to a permanent peace agreement. Katia Lopez-Hodayan for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests. In the Colombian capital, Bogotá, is Jorge Restrepo, director of the Conflict Analysis Resource Center. That's a non-governmental organization which studies armed groups. In Denver, in the U.S. state of Colorado, is Elizabeth Dickinson, a senior analyst for Colombia at the International Crisis Group. Her work focuses on the dynamics of armed conflict. And also in Bogotá is Laura Bonilla, deputy director of the Peace and Reconciliation Foundation. A warm welcome to Inside Story. Jorge, can I just come to you first with our first question? Because it doesn't matter where we are, ordinary people around the world hear that an armed group and a government have decided to talk to each other. They've laid down their arms. Peace talks are ongoing, possibly a lasting peace, breathing a sigh of relief. No more civilians getting killed, no more innocents being kidnapped. Can we breathe a sigh of relief here now with this agreement between the Colombian government and the ELN?
Yes, indeed. And thank you very much for having us. Yes, indeed. This is a sign of relief. It will be a temporary respite, nevertheless. This is more like a truce rather than a definite and permanent ceasefire, in the sense that it will allow the government and the ELN, this guerrilla group, to conduct negotiations. A group, by the way, that has increased over the past 7 months significantly its violent actions. And although it has reduced also significantly the level of kidnapping and terrorist actions, it still conduct very many acts of violence that affect at least 4 rather large regions of the country.
Elizabeth, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think building on what Jorge said, this is an enormous win for the government. And I think what the ceasefire is meant to do more than anything is to create that space where negotiators can really start to discuss what it would look like to come to some sort of agreement. I do think, though, that we have to be very clear about what this ceasefire is and it isn't. This ceasefire is specifically related to clashes between the ELN armed group and government forces. And the vast majority of violence that civilians in ELN areas experience today is not related to that specific type of violence. It's much more closely related to the ELN fighting other armed groups, to methods of social control, forced recruitment, extortion, kidnapping, things that aren't necessarily under the purview of the ceasefire. So I think it's a very important first step. Our message to the government and to the negotiators is that it is the first step, and that the most important thing is to work towards bringing real relief to the civilians who are living in everyday conflict.
And we'll unpick that, I think, question by question as we go through the next half hour. Laura, can I bring you in again from Bogota? Good to have you with us on the programme, because you've heard that sort of first question. But past history tells us that really since 1964, the ELN, were around and they've been in existence. A total of 7 major negotiation periods have occurred historically. They've all failed. It's not a great track record, is it, either for them or for government? So from where you're sitting, Laura, in Bogota, what do you want to see happen, certainly in the next few weeks?
Well, that is right. The ELN has approximately 7 or 8 peace processes or peace dialogues with different governments. And in all the cases, or the government or the ELN commit sabotage against the peace process. But the point is that right now, specifically this process is more, have more advantages than before. First of all, this is the first government that agreed that the peace process with ELN will have a very broad participation from all the sides of society, which is really key for the ELN peace. And at the same time, the ELN see more connections or more possibilities to achieve certain social changes, especially in territorial areas. That is the good side. In the not so good side, it is true that this is a very fragile process due to several things. First, due to the untrustful, of ELN, especially of the leaders of ELN, and second, because the ELN is a very decentralized armed group. So it is possible that if the ELN have internal struggles, that struggles will reflect in a
physically on the ground as well. We'll get into the hierarchy of the ELN a little bit later as well. Jorge, can I just come back to you in terms of the immediate here and now? What positive moves would you like to see by either side in the next 180 days?
Well, the government and the ELN also agreed to, apart from an agenda, to conduct what they call a participation process for the civilian society, particularly that which are in the regions where the ELN has presence, to attain some sort of additional agenda, which is defined by the communities. That is what is going to be going on for the next few months. But I want to go back to the point that Elizabeth mentioned, which I think it is critical for the success of this peace negotiation, which is the fact that the ELN in every area where it operates in Colombia is facing violent disputes with other groups. Most of them are criminal armed groups. The ELN moved from having a war against the state to have a war against, or a multiplicity of wars against several armed groups. And the security apparatus need to address those conflicts between the ELN and those groups. And that is a rather difficult objective to find success by the national government.
And again, Elizabeth, I bring you in here because, you know, the agreement doesn't really stop the ELN, as you suggested, and as all of our guests have said, you know, that the terrorization or the terror that is created by armed groups, whether it be attacks on the public, kidnappings, I mean, there's been no mention of this in this truce. So that may still carry on, but it's interesting to wonder how the president and the negotiating teams are going to tackle that. You know, no more terrorism, no more kidnappings, no more extortion.
Well, it's particularly complicated because I think it's really important to understand what life is like in ELN areas. When we visit communities, for example, in a region like Arauca, which is a place where the ELN is quite consolidated, daily life really revolves around the control that this group exercises. So even simple things, for example, if I have a dispute with my neighbor over where my land ends and his land begins, I don't go to the police or the judicial system to adjudicate that dispute. I'm going to the ELN. The ELN are laying down justice. They're setting the rules of sort of commerce. The levels of extortion have increased dramatically. And I think part of the clamping down that we've witnessed in ELN areas is precisely related to the threat that they have faced from other armed groups. And again, I think this is a very important point of the ceasefire. The ceasefire at this point offers the ELN a tactical advantage in the sense that it does free their hand to not worry so much about the military and focus on the threat that they're facing from other armed groups. So I think there is a risk here that despite the fact that we see lower clashes between the ELN and state forces, we could see an increase or a heating up of the conflicts between the ELN and other armed groups in their areas.
OK, Laura, let me bring you in here because one wonders what has brought now both sides to the negotiating table. Is it a case that both sides realise they can't win the battle against one or the other and that they do have to talk to each other and there is an incentive for peace? There are benefits to putting your arms down.
Well, if I understand well the questions, I want to say that there is two different tables in Colombia. So we are at the same time negotiating with two different groups. One of them is the ELN, and the second one is a dissident group coming from former FARC guerrilla. And that two processes are quite connected. So if one process, if the ceasefire with the ELN will be, good, the second ceasefire also will be good. And if not, well, we will have the situation that Elizabeth well described. We will see an increase of violence. But on the other hand, we also can see a decrease of violence because in the ceasefire with the ELN, in the protocols, in the specific protocols, there is included the accomplishment of international right of human rights. So it's not only that the ELN will the attacks against the state, and at the same time, in the second peace table, they are also negotiating a ceasefire with the same conditions. Finally, in other regions, but it's not the majoritarian presence of ELN, there is criminal gangs and different kind of groups. And in that part of the country, of course, the government and the security forces should be more present in the field in order to protect the ceasefire, but also in order to recover the control of the territory, which right now is not in the hands of the state.
OK. Jorge, you were nodding in agreement. I think you wanted to come in there.
A little bit on the fact that on kidnapping, let me put it this way. The peace process with the ELN that has been successfully moved until now by this government is very different from the one that we managed to get a peace agreement with the FARC. and in one particular subject, which is the fact that the FARC decided to abandon kidnapping, to release kidnappees that were in their hands well before the start of the negotiation. In this case, the ELN has not made any kind of political or public declaration that they will stop kidnapping. Then one of the main risks that this peace process will face will be the capacity of the ELN to control its groups. In the case, for example, that they decide to kidnap someone for ransom in the regions where they operate. That will send this process to a critical situation, especially because this process doesn't have the high support, political and public support by the citizenry in Colombia that had other previous peace processes. And I'm worried about that. The fact that the ELN has decided not to abandon those atrocious forms of violence, including terrorism and kidnapping, it's rather worrisome. Nevertheless, the protocols do say that the ELN cannot commit violations of the international humanitarian law, including, of course, kidnapping and, for example, the recruitment of minors.
Okay. Certainly, Elizabeth is agreeing with you. I want to come back to you again in a moment, Jorge, because, Elizabeth, what's different about this peace agreement? And Jorge sort of slightly touched on it, about how the FARC reacted to wanting peace, to how the ELN is now talking peace. There are very specific differences, aren't they, in the way that they are in communication with the government?
Well, I think the first one, and the most important perhaps, is that the ELN watched the FARC negotiations, and I think took many lessons from that are now coloring the current process. And I think probably the one that will be the most definitive is that the ELN considers that the FARC gave up far too much and received far too little. And that has affected most directly the question of disarmament, which will inevitably be very difficult to negotiate. And the ELN, at least at this point, talks about a gradual disarmament process rather than giving up their weapons all at once as the FARC did, but rather sort of handing in their weapons at the speed with which the government also complies with its part of the bargain. Now, this has advantages and disadvantages, and of course it's been done in many different peace processes. In Ireland, for example, the laying down of arms was gradual, and I think that this is something that's going to be a very major point of tension, more than anything else, with public opinion. Because of the precedent that was set with the FARC that there was an immediate handing over of weapons, I think that's the expectation of the Colombian public for future processes, but it's going to be very difficult for this government to make that argument with the ELN. And okay, you know, why have they taken that lesson? And I think this is a more broadly something that needs to be considered in these processes. It's because the implementation of the 2016 agreement with the FARC has been very slow. It's been behind schedule. There are many aspects that have fallen short. And that is a concern. It raises questions about the credibility of the government to make commitments, just as it raises questions about the ability of these different armed groups to make commitments.
Yeah. Indeed. I mean, it raises huge questions. Can I ask Lara in Bogota?
Yes.
It raises questions for the government, but it also raises questions for the public, doesn't it? From your opinion, from where you're sitting in Colombia, how are the public reacting to this?
Well, it's divided. You know, the public in Colombia is also, you know, it's divided, like with the peace agreement, like regarding the peace agreement with FARC, because on that time, remember that we voted against the peace process with FARC. So the public opinion was not totally agreed with that peace process, and is basically the same right now. So the society, the Colombian society is divided, the Colombian society is polarizing, and of course that will affect the possibilities of peace. But I also want to say, you know, and to support Elizabeth on this, the implementation of the peace agreement with FARC has been a total disaster. Just because one point. Right now, we have more than 300 people who signed the peace agreement, you know, from FARC side, and they have been murdered right now. And this is the first that create an untrustful environment with ELN. So, of course, it's really difficult to recover that trustful on government side. And in the other aspects of the peace agreement also have a very slow implementation, and that has been the tradition historically with peace agreements in Colombia. So we sign peace agreements. We are quite good with the mobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of ex-combatants, but we are quite bad guaranteeing the life of the people who are signing the peace agreements, and also we are quite bad guarantee the implementation of what we are signing as a society.
Well, Jorge, I know you were sort of nodding and disagreeing, but I do want to move this on a little bit because I'm sure you're going to add into this conversation. Because the difference between now and then is that you have a leftist president. You had a right-wing government and a right-wing president before. But to add to this, and just for our viewers, we want to, again, show them the presence of ELN in Colombia. We're bringing up a map for them. And the one thing about ELN, which is different to FARC, is that each area that they control is controlled independently. This is not a pyramid structure with one leader at the top, which hence makes negotiation even more difficult, doesn't it?
Although over the past 2 years, I have to say that the ELN has managed to gain control and command to all its fronts, even one minor front in the Department of Chocó, it's already under control of the central command, the COSE of the ELN. Then I think that won't be the main difference. I will be the main difference that the ELN does not have that national reach, that national logistic structure. And of course, it's of very minor size compared to what it was the FARC back then, which was a fighting guerrilla against the state. The ELN, on the other hand, is more radical, close to fanaticism, I will say. Then, although there are very large differences, I will say that most of those differences come from the political size or the political definition of the ELN, a guerrilla which is rather not so stick to ideology, to that peasant defendant structure that had the FARC.
Okay.
And if you allow me to go back to the previous point, what I just wanted to say is that the ELN is not the utmost and most important problem for the national polity here in Colombia. There are other problems, including, for example, the growing by day scandal of campaign finance that brought the left-wing government of Gustavo Petro to the presidency and the indictment to its son.
Indeed. Let's bring in Elizabeth here, because the one interesting thing is that you have various presidents, Pastrana, Uribe, Santos, Duque, and now Petro. Petro has an advantage. He has been a man who picked up arms and fought. He has a way, an understanding of talking to armed groups. Is that an advantage at this moment in time?
Well, I think that's what the government came into office expecting. And I think, unfortunately, it's proven more difficult than they had anticipated. I think it does confer advantages in the sense that there is a level of understanding and also trust between the negotiating teams that is quite unique. At the same time, I fear that the ELN has a longer agenda with someone that they believe is more sympathetic to their causes. If you're negotiating with a hardliner, you're really going to pick what points you're going to push for, where your red lines are, and what you really want. But the fact that this government is sympathetic in the sense, in the sense that there is an interaction and a trust that's been built, I think it does extend the agenda. And I think in some ways it makes it more complicated. It also, frankly, makes it harder to sell to that right-wing part of the Colombian public, the skeptical part of the Colombian public, who fears that a peace deal between this government and the ELN will basically be handing the keys of the kingdom over to this guerrilla organization. Of course, that's not the case. It's never been the case. And I think the government's negotiating position has been very firm in this regard. But public perception does have its own life of its own sometimes.
OK, Laura, can I bring you in here again from Bogota? Because obviously, we've been talking ELN in government, but there are a lot more actors involved here. You've got the Cuban government who've been sort of negotiating and helping to nurture the talks. Interested parties like Venezuela on one side, the United States further north. There are a lot of people who will or will not benefit from these two sides talking.
But definitely, there is a lot of people that will not have benefits of people talking or a peace process, but there is also more people that will be benefit, if the peace process will succeed. Regarding the United States, I think that this government have a very good approach to the ELN process and also even to the public policy about drugs and the war against drugs of Petro government. So I think that Petro, had a good management of the relationship with the United States, and also he opened the border with Venezuela. Which is true is that for me, the most important challenge right now in the process with the ELN is what to do with the ELN within Venezuela, in Venezuela, because the presence of this armed group is quite big on that country. And I think that no the Colombian government or the Venezuelan government have accepted, the level of the challenge here.
Oh, it's great because I've got Jorge nodding his head in disagreement and Elizabeth nodding in agreement. So just very quickly, I'd like to ask about your comments to what Laura has just said. Elizabeth, let's have you first. Why were you nodding?
Well, I think this is an enormous challenge because this is a binational guerrilla movement with presence on both sides of the border. And there are real questions about whether I think how you will deal with the ELN fighters who happen to be on the other side of that border. But I wanted to make two really important points in that regard. The first one is that we've had, because of the opening of relations with Venezuela, something very important has happened at a low tech, logistical and tactical level on the ground. For the first time in more than 40 years, military commanders on the Colombian side can now share information with their Venezuelan counterparts and vice versa. This is very important because guerrilla movements, not just the ELN, also FARC dissidents, other criminal organizations are constantly moving back and forth. The fact that we can now share information de-escalates the situation significantly. And that is a step forward in how we deal with the complications of this situation.
OK, with that, sadly, we have to leave the conversation. It's a very interesting one. I'm sure we'll be coming back to it in 180 days when we have some sort of resolution to what's going to happen or how it's going to move forward. To my guests in Bogota, Jorge Restrepo and Laura Bonilla, and in Denver, Colorado, Elizabeth Dickinson. Thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for watching as well. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman, and the whole team here, thanks for your time and your company.